The North Atlantic, 1943. A German submarine surfaces under the cover of darkness, its crew confident they remain invisible to the enemy. The captain reads coordinates transmitted from U-boat command, orders encrypted through a machine so sophisticated that the Germans believe no human mind could ever decipher its secrets. He does not know that hundreds of kilometers away, in a quiet English manor house, those same coordinates have already been decoded. A convoy has been rerouted. Aircraft are being scrambled. The hunter is about to become the prey. This is the story of how a secret code, once thought invincible, became the silent executioner of the German submarine fleet. If you find stories like this fascinating, take a moment to subscribe and let us know in the comments where you are watching from today. To understand how the Allies unraveled the greatest cipher system of its time, we must first step into the mind of those who created it. The Enigma machine was not born from military necessity. It was originally designed for commercial use in the early 1920s by a German engineer named Arthur Scherbius. He envisioned businesses using it to protect trade secrets, but it was the German military that recognized its true potential. By the time Adolf Hitler rose to power, the Enigma had become the backbone of Nazi military communications. Every branch of the armed forces relied upon it. The Army, the Air Force, and most critically, the Kriegsmarine, the German Navy. The machine itself resembled a typewriter housed in a wooden box. But inside, a complex arrangement of rotors, plug boards, and electrical pathways created a labyrinth of encryption that seemed mathematically impossible to penetrate. When an operator pressed a key, an electrical signal passed through a series of rotating wheels, each containing 26 contact points corresponding to the letters of the alphabet. The signal bounced through the rotors, reflected off a component called the reflector, and traveled back through the rotors again before illuminating a different letter on a lamp board. The operator would then write down this illuminated letter as part of the encrypted message. The genius of the system lay in its variability. Each time a key was pressed, at least one rotor would advance, changing the entire electrical pathway. This meant that pressing the same letter twice in succession would produce two completely different encrypted letters. The number of possible configurations was astronomical, with 3 rotors chosen from a set of 5, a plug board that could swap pairs of letters, and ring settings that altered the internal wiring alignment. The total number of possible starting positions exceeded 158 million. The Germans were convinced that even if an enemy captured an Enigma machine, they could never test every possible setting in time to read messages before they became obsolete. But the Germans made a critical miscalculation. They underestimated human ingenuity, and they underestimated the determination of a small group of mathematicians, linguists, and puzzle solvers who would dedicate their lives to cracking the uncrackable. The story of Enigma's downfall begins not in Britain, but in Poland. In the years before the Second World War, Polish intelligence had grown increasingly alarmed at German rearmament. They knew that any future conflict would depend heavily on intercepting enemy communications. In 1932, a young Polish mathematician named Marian Rejewski achieved what many believed impossible. Working with limited information, including documents obtained through a French spy inside the German cipher office, Rejewski reconstructed the internal wiring of the Enigma rotors through pure mathematical analysis. He did not possess a machine. He did not have the daily settings, yet through brilliant deduction and an understanding of group theory that was decades ahead of its time, he mapped out the electrical pathways that transformed plain text into cipher. Rejewski and his colleagues, Jerzy Różycki and Henryk Zygalski, built replica Enigma machines and developed techniques to determine the daily settings used by German operators. They created devices called bombas, electromechanical machines that could test multiple rotor positions simultaneously. For years, Polish intelligence read German military communications in near real time. But in 1938, the Germans increased the complexity of the system. They added 2 additional rotors to the selection pool and changed operational procedures. The Polish methods, designed for a 3-rotor system with limited configurations, could no longer keep pace. With war looming and their country facing invasion, the Polish cryptanalysts made a decision that would alter the course of history. In July 1939, just weeks before Germany invaded Poland, they shared everything they knew with British and French intelligence. They handed over replica Enigma machines, technical documents, and the theoretical foundations of their code-breaking work. The baton had been passed. The British established their code-breaking headquarters at Bletchley Park, a Victorian estate located 50 miles northwest of London. What began as a small operation with a few dozen staff would eventually grow into a complex employing nearly 10,000 people. But in those early months, the work was painstaking, and the successes were few. The Polish methods provided a foundation, but the increased complexity of the German system demanded new approaches. Enter Alan Turing. A Cambridge mathematician with an unconventional mind and an extraordinary gift for abstract thinking, Turing arrived at Bletchley Park in September 1939. He was 27 years old. Within months, he had designed an improved version of the Polish bomba, a machine that would become known simply as the bomb. Where the Polish device relied on exploiting a specific flaw in German operating procedures, Turing's machine attacked the fundamental mathematics of the Enigma system itself. The bomb worked by testing possible rotor settings against a piece of presumed plain text, what the codebreakers called a crib. If analysts suspected that a message contained a particular phrase, perhaps a standard greeting or a weather report format, they could feed this assumption into the machine. The bomba would then electrically simulate thousands of Enigma configurations, searching for one that produced the expected relationship between plain text and ciphertext. When it found a match, the machine would stop, and human analysts would verify whether the setting was correct. It was not instant. It was not foolproof. But it transformed code-breaking from an impossible mathematical challenge into a difficult but achievable industrial process. By the summer of 1940, the first operational bombs were running at Bletchley Park. The race against Enigma had entered a new phase, but machines alone could not crack the code. The bombs needed cribs, and cribs required insight into German communication habits. This is where the human element became crucial. The code breakers at Bletchley Park were not simply mathematicians. They were linguists who understood the peculiarities of German military language. They were analysts who memorized the writing styles of individual German operators. They were puzzle enthusiasts who could spot patterns invisible to others. One of the most valuable sources of cribs came from German procedural laziness. Despite strict regulations against predictable messages, operators frequently began transmissions with standard phrases. Weather reports followed consistent formats. Some operators, perhaps bored or careless, used girlfriends' names or crude jokes as their daily settings. Every such mistake was a gift to Bletchley Park. The codebreakers cataloged these tendencies, building a database of German habits that made each new day's setting slightly easier to crack. If you are enjoying this deep dive into one of history's greatest intelligence triumphs, now would be a good time to hit that subscribe button. There is much more to uncover. The German Navy presented a unique challenge. While the Army and Air Force Enigma networks were eventually penetrated with some regularity, the Kriegsmarine used a more secure variant of the machine. Naval Enigma employed additional rotors and more rigorous operating procedures. The stakes were also higher. In the Battle of the Atlantic, Allied shipping losses were catastrophic. German U-boats, operating in coordinated groups called wolf packs, were strangling Britain's supply lines. Without American food, fuel, and weapons, Britain could not survive, let alone fight back. Cracking naval Enigma was not merely an intelligence priority. It was an existential necessity. The breakthrough came not from mathematics alone, but from desperate courage at sea. On May 9, 1941, the convoy escort group led by HMS Bulldog detected a German submarine on the surface. The U-boat, designated U-110, was commanded by Kapitän Leutnant Fritz Julius Lemp, the same officer who had infamously sunk the passenger liner Athenia on the first day of the war. As British destroyers closed in, Lemp ordered his crew to abandon ship and scuttle the vessel, but the demolition charges failed. The U-boat remained afloat. Sub-Lieutenant David Baum led a boarding party across the gap between the vessels. Climbing down into the darkened hull of an enemy submarine that might sink or explode at any moment required extraordinary nerve. What Baum and his men found inside changed the course of the war. They recovered an intact Enigma machine, complete with its rotors. They found code books, signal logs, and, crucially, the current settings for the naval cipher network. Lemp, realizing what was happening, attempted to swim back to his submarine. He was never seen again. Whether he drowned or was killed remains unknown to this day. The capture of U-110 was kept absolutely secret. The British went to extraordinary lengths to ensure the Germans never suspected their codes had been compromised. The captured submarine was towed toward port, but deliberately sank en route to prevent any possibility of German reconnaissance aircraft spotting an intact U-boat in Allied hands. The surviving German crew were isolated and held incommunicado for the remainder of the war. Official records were falsified. The entire operation was erased from public knowledge. But at Bletchley Park, the captured materials opened a window into German naval communications that had been firmly closed. For the first time, the code breakers could read U-boat operational signals. They could track the movements of wolf packs. They could anticipate attacks before they happened. Yet the advantage was fragile. The Germans changed their code books regularly, and each change meant weeks of renewed effort to crack the new settings. In February 1942, the Kriegsmarine introduced a fourth rotor to its submarine Enigma machines, creating a variant called Triton, known to the Allies as Shark. Overnight, the Atlantic went dark. The code breakers at Bletchley Park could no longer read U-boat communications. For 10 agonizing months, Allied shipping losses soared. Convoys sailed blind, unable to route around the waiting wolf packs. Hundreds of thousands of tons of supplies destined for Britain and the Soviet Union ended up on the ocean floor. The situation was dire. Unless Shark could be broken, the Battle of the Atlantic might be lost. The answer came from another act of extraordinary bravery. On October 30, 1942, a British task force located U-559 in the eastern Mediterranean. The submarine, damaged by depth charges, surfaced and began to sink. 2 sailors from HMS Petard, Lieutenant Anthony Fasson and able seaman Colin Grazier, swam to the stricken U-boat and climbed inside. They knew the vessel was flooding. They knew they had minutes at most. Working in near darkness as water rose around them, they passed code books and documents up through the hatch to a canteen assistant named Tommy Brown, who was only 16 years old. Fasson and Grazier refused to leave until they had recovered everything of value. They were still inside when U-559 slipped beneath the waves. Both men drowned. They were awarded the George Cross posthumously. Tommy Brown received the George Medal, but was later discharged when the Navy discovered his true age. The materials recovered from U-559 included the short weather signal codebook, a document that allowed Bletchley Park to finally crack the 4-rotor Shark cipher. By December 1942, the code breakers were reading U-boat communications again. The blackout was over. From this point forward, the Allies would maintain an almost continuous window into German submarine operations. The intelligence derived from these decrypts was codenamed Ultra. It would become the most closely guarded secret of the entire war. The impact of Ultra on the Battle of the Atlantic cannot be overstated. Before the code breakers achieved their breakthrough, convoy routing was essentially reactive. Allied commanders knew that wolf packs were operating in the North Atlantic, but they could only guess at their locations. Ships sailed on predetermined routes, hoping to avoid contact. When a wolf pack found a convoy, the resulting battle was often devastating. U-boats would shadow the convoy during daylight hours, then surface at night to attack. A single night could see half a dozen ships sent to the bottom, but with ultra-intelligence, the equation reversed entirely. Bletchley Park could now read the operational orders that Admiral Karl Dönitz, commander of the U-boat fleet, transmitted to his submarines. They knew where the wolf packs were being directed. They knew which patrol lines were being established. They could predict where the Germans expected to find targets. Armed with this knowledge, the Admiralty's submarine tracking room could route convoys around the danger zones. The effect was dramatic. Convoys that would previously have sailed directly into waiting wolf packs were diverted onto safer paths. Losses dropped sharply. But the Allies faced a delicate problem. If convoy evasion became too effective, the Germans might suspect their codes were compromised. Every decision had to balance operational necessity against security. Sometimes convoys were deliberately sent into danger to protect the ultra-secret. Commanders lived with the terrible knowledge that ships would be sunk to preserve a greater advantage. The calculus was brutal but clear. One convoy lost to protect Ultra was a tragedy. The loss of Ultra itself would be catastrophic. The Germans never fully grasped what was happening. Dönitz grew increasingly frustrated as his wolf packs repeatedly failed to find targets. He suspected treachery, perhaps a spy within the U-boat command structure. He suspected technological advances, perhaps improved radar on Allied aircraft and ships. He suspected bad luck. What he did not suspect, could not bring himself to believe, was that Enigma itself had been broken. The machine was mathematically perfect. The procedures were rigorous. The cipher must be secure. This blind faith in their own technology was perhaps the Germans' greatest vulnerability. Even when presented with evidence suggesting a compromise, they dismissed it. In early 1943, a German naval intelligence investigation examined whether Enigma might be insecure. The investigators concluded that while minor procedural lapses existed, the fundamental system was unbreakable. They recommended against any major changes. The wolf packs continued to transmit their positions, their plans, their vulnerabilities, all in a cipher the Allies could read. The turning point came in May 1943. Dönitz launched a major offensive against Allied convoys, concentrating unprecedented numbers of submarines in the North Atlantic. He believed this massive effort would overwhelm Allied defenses and restore the U-boat's dominance. Instead, it became a catastrophe. Armed with ultra-intelligence, the Allies knew exactly where the wolf packs were forming. Convoy routes were adjusted. Support groups of destroyers and frigates were positioned to reinforce threatened convoys. Long-range aircraft, including the new Very Long-Range Liberators, capable of covering the mid-Atlantic gap, patrolled the approaches. The Germans sailed into a trap they could not see. In a single month, 43 U-boats were destroyed. The losses were staggering. Nearly 1/4 of the operational submarine fleet wiped out in 31 days. On May 24th, Dönitz made the agonizing decision to withdraw his submarines from the North Atlantic. The offensive had failed. The Battle of the Atlantic was not over, but the strategic balance had shifted irrevocably. Never again would the U-boats threaten to sever Britain's lifeline. Never again would the wolf packs dominate the convoy routes. The hunters had become the hunted, and they did not understand why. The technology that sealed the U-boat's fate extended beyond code-breaking alone. Ultra-intelligence was most effective when combined with other advances that made submarine detection and destruction far more efficient. High-frequency direction finding, nicknamed Huff Duff by Allied sailors, allowed escort ships to pinpoint the location of U-boats from their radio transmissions. Every time a submarine sent a message, even a brief signal acknowledging orders. It revealed its approximate position. Escort commanders could then vector aircraft or surface ships toward the contact. Improved radar, particularly centimetric radar, operating on wavelengths the Germans could not detect, stripped away the U-boat's traditional advantage of surfacing at night. Previously, submarines had operated with near impunity in darkness, their low profiles invisible to the eye and undetectable by early radar sets. But the new equipment could spot a periscope or a surfaced submarine at considerable range, even in heavy seas. U-boat crews found themselves under attack without warning, bombs falling from aircraft they never saw coming. The Lee Light, a powerful searchlight fitted to maritime patrol aircraft, transformed nighttime hunting. An aircraft would approach using radar, then illuminate the submarine with blinding intensity at the last moment, giving the aircrew a clear view for their attack. The combination was deadly. Depth charges and aerial torpedoes became increasingly sophisticated. Ahead-throwing weapons like the Hedgehog allowed escort ships to attack a submerged submarine before passing over it, eliminating the sonar blind spot that had previously given U-boats precious seconds to evade. Acoustic homing torpedoes, codenamed V-2 by the Allies, could track the sound of a submarine's propellers and strike even a diving target. The cumulative effect of these technologies, guided by the invisible hand of ultra-intelligence, transformed the Atlantic from a hunting ground into a killing field. Dönitz refused to accept defeat. He believed that technological innovation could restore the U-boat's edge. The snorkel, a breathing device that allowed submarines to run their diesel engines while submerged, promised to neutralize the radar threat by keeping U-boats beneath the surface. The Type 21 and Type 23 electro-boot, revolutionary designs with streamlined hulls and massive battery capacity, offered speeds and endurance underwater that far exceeded conventional submarines. In theory, these boats could outrun escort ships while submerged and launch attacks without ever exposing themselves on the surface. But theory and reality diverged sharply. The advanced submarines were plagued by production delays, quality control failures, and sabotage by forced laborers in German factories. Allied bombing disrupted manufacturing and assembly. Training crews for the complex new systems took time that Germany did not have. By the time the Elektroboote began entering service in meaningful numbers, the war was almost over. The promised counteroffensive never materialized. The human cost of the Atlantic campaign was immense on both sides. More than 30,000 German submariners perished, a casualty rate exceeding 70%. Nearly 3,000 Allied merchant ships were sunk, along with hundreds of warships. Tens of thousands of merchant sailors lost their lives, many drowning in icy waters far from land, their ships burning or broken around them. The conditions inside a U-boat were almost unimaginably harsh. Submarines were cramped, poorly ventilated, and damp. Crews lived in constant proximity to diesel fumes, unwashed bodies, and rotting food. Fresh water was rationed. Privacy was non-existent. Every man knew that a single mistake, a single depth charge finding its mark, could mean death for the entire crew. The psychological strain of operating in waters where the enemy seemed to anticipate every move must have been crushing. Men who had volunteered for the submarine service as an elite force found themselves treated as expendable. Dönitz sent patrol after patrol into waters where survival was no longer probable. The commanding admiral, later Grand Admiral of the entire German Navy, lost both of his sons to submarine warfare. One drowned when his U-boat was sunk. The other was killed when his vessel was lost with all hands. For the Allies, the victory in the Atlantic was essential, but never certain until it was achieved. Churchill later wrote that the U-boat peril was the only thing that truly frightened him during the war. Without American supplies reaching Britain, the war could not have been sustained. Without secure sea lanes, the great invasions of North Africa, Sicily, Italy, and ultimately Normandy would have been impossible. The men and women of Bletchley Park, working in secrecy and obscurity, contributed as much to victory as any division on the battlefield. Their achievement was hidden for decades. Ultra remained classified until the 1970s. Many of those who served as code breakers went to their graves without ever revealing what they had done. Alan Turing, whose brilliance had been instrumental in the breakthrough, was prosecuted after the war for his homosexuality, a crime under British law at the time. He was subjected to chemical castration and took his own life in 1954. His contributions were not publicly acknowledged until long after his death. The Enigma story holds lessons that resonate far beyond its historical moment. The Germans built a system they believed was perfect. They invested absolute faith in its security. When evidence suggested it might be compromised, they dismissed the possibility because they could not imagine their mathematics being wrong. This blindness, this certainty that their creation was beyond challenge, was their undoing. The Allies succeeded not because they were inherently smarter, but because they were willing to question every assumption, to collaborate across disciplines, and to treat failure as information rather than defeat. The mathematicians needed the linguists. The engineers needed the sailors willing to risk their lives boarding sinking submarines. The analysts needed the machine operators, many of them women who ran the bombs around the clock in shifts. Victory came from integration, not isolation. The operational security maintained around Ultra remains remarkable even by modern standards. Thousands of people knew the secret. Not one of them betrayed it. Information derived from decrypts was never acted upon in ways that could reveal its source. When a breakthrough came that might have shortened the war by days or weeks, commanders sometimes held back, protecting the greater advantage. This discipline, this willingness to sacrifice immediate gains for strategic victory, required extraordinary trust and coordination across multiple nations and military services. The fact that it held for years, through countless operations and thousands of individual decisions, is itself a testament to the seriousness with which the Allies treated their intelligence advantage. For the German submariners, there is something tragic in their fate. They fought with courage and skill in a service that demanded everything from its men. Many of them were not ideological Nazis, but professional sailors doing what they believed was their duty. They went to sea knowing the odds grew worse with each patrol. They died in darkness, far from home, in ships that had become iron coffins. Their defeat was not due to any lack of bravery. It was decided in quiet rooms by people they never met, working on problems they never knew existed. The secret code that made them helpless was never discovered in time to save them. They never saw it coming. As we reach the conclusion of this story, remember that history is filled with turning points that hinged on secrets kept and secrets broken. If this journey through the shadows of the Atlantic War has given you a new perspective on how intelligence shapes conflict, consider subscribing and sharing this video with others who appreciate the hidden dimensions of history. The story of Enigma is not just about machines and mathematics. It is about human determination, sacrifice, and the relentless pursuit of knowledge in the face of impossible odds. Until next time, keep exploring the past, because the lessons it holds are never truly obsolete.